All right, for our penultimate session this afternoon, I want to introduce two members of the Open Threat Research Project. That would be Ben Bornholm and Carlos Rosas, who tells me that he feels weird if I call him by his real name. So we'll call him by his more well-known by his handle, Plug. So I'm sure Plug and Ben will have much more to say about the OTR project and why they don't like their first names. But it's basically a collaboration. OTR is basically a collaboration between researchers at different companies and with different specialties that collaborate and share information. It's especially useful when it comes to the topic of today's session, which is essentially how we combine threat intelligence about a specific actor, offensive security techniques to emulate that actor's behavior, and why we might want to do that for purposes of doing better threat hunting. So Plug, Ben, please take it away.
So really quick, thank you for the introduction. So let's kind of dive in really quick. So this is about open threat research. What we did is basically a project called Hunt for Red, in this case for red apples, and we decided to emulate Ocean Lotus on macOS. So let's dive in really quick. The agenda for today, we're going to talk briefly about us. You already heard about us. We're going to talk about what Hunt for Red is, what's the difference between emulation and simulation, the pipeline that we built for this project, why we picked Ocean Lotus. Then we're going to try to share some of the things that we did on the project and some takeaways, and finally some questions if we have time. So really quick. So about us. So my name is Carlos. I do incident response. I do threat hunting for Yahoo currently, and I love synthesizers. Ben?
Hey y'all, my name's Ben. I'm the author of HoldMyBeerSecurity.com, and at my day job, I'm on the Dart team at Dropbox as an incident responder.
Awesome. So other Hunt team members that Hunt for Red that are not here with us is Kat. She works for Mitre. We also have Dan Borges and Tilo Tomasanial. Dan actually just released a book, so if you haven't seen it, check it out. And Tilo actually works with me on the Fire team, so kudos to all of them because we made that possible with all of us. Open Threat Research is a project that basically is a community that exists, and the main goal is to collaborate, share, and contribute open source initiatives, and so we're part of that community. So what is Hunt for Red? So basically, Hunt for Red is a project where we design an in-depth workshop designed to teach threat hunting concepts by emulating a known adversary. Our main goals for this workshop were to showcase and teach how to properly emulate keyword an adversary. We want to do this by backing our research with threat intelligence. We want to represent the content, going by the manual attack life cycle. You will know why. And everything what we built is to be open source. Absolutely everything. We are doing that. We did that through the Open Threat Research, and we presented this during DAFCON 29. Part of the goal was, whenever possible, to collaborate with Mitre or some other OTR initiatives. And one of the things we want to do is it needed to be completely free. So one of the objectives for us is we wanted to present these based on the phases of the type life cycle. We wanted to concentrate on macOS, and we basically are going to walk you through some of those phases. And all of that was basically done through open source threat intelligence that we collected. So let's talk about the attack life cycle.
Yeah, so one of the biggest common questions that we get is why the attack life cycle? And my response to that is our target audience for this workshop is typically beginners to intermediate folks. And some of those participants have never seen an attack from start to finish. So what we do is we use the red team exercise, and we try to create like a story. And then we use the phases of the attack lifecycle to kind of walk through that story and use the phases as chapters. And in each phase of the attack lifecycle, we talk about the red team exercise and what was performed, but then we also talk the blue team side, which is the threat hunting component of it. I mean, one of the biggest drivers of doing this type of model is we want participants to learn how to hunt for malicious activities, but we also want them to understand their findings within respect to the attack lifecycle. So a common example that I use to kind of bring this all together is, say you're hunting for malicious activity and you discover an attacker is dumping the Apple keychain database. And for those who are unfamiliar with the Apple keychain database, it stores usernames and passwords and the Wi-Fi password and things like that. And so if you find this activity, what we want people to take away is that means that an attacker was able to initially compromise your environment. Then they probably establish some foothold to ensure that they keep onto that initial compromised machine. Depending on the user that they may have targeted, they may be a normal user and had to escalate privileges to be able to dump the keychain database. So up until that point, we've kind of discussed about where the attacker has been, but also what we want people to take away is also where might the attacker go next. So with that keychain database, the attacker has usernames and passwords to access internal resources or to potentially move laterally in the environment. And so this is kind of what it looks like when you kind of put it into respect of the attack lifecycle with Mitre attack techniques, is that in each phase we have techniques kind of described that's happening about the red team exercise. And this is kind of what that breakdown looks like.
So let's talk about emulations and simulation. And the reality is that the devil is in the details. So let's break those down. So when you do emulations, right, you ideally want to work on detailed behaviors. When you're doing simulations, detail or basic behavior is acceptable, and you don't need to worry too much about the details. When you do emulations, you really want to imitate or recreate as close as possible the real thing. When you do simulations, imitation is not really required. You do have a lot of freedom to try many ideas. Another thing about emulation is it does require in-depth research and realism. Both of them are required. When you do simulation, you can do in-depth research, but isn't required. And realism also isn't required. So there's a distinction between the two. Both of them have their pros and cons. We're not going to have time to dive into them, but it's very important you keep that in mind. We decided to emulate Ocean Lotus. So why did we pick Ocean Lotus? Well, first, to understand that, there's many ways to kind of narrow down the scope when you do threat hunting. And in this case, we want to do an actor-centric approach. This is where Kat from our team from Mitre was a key element for us. And what you see in here is basically us doing all the research, connected back to Mitre and mapping this actor, right? And so everything's backed by the TTPs and the threat lineages that we collected. Now, some of the requirements for us to pick Ocean Lotus was we wanted to do something that was macOS based. There's not a lot of macOS threat hunting, so we want to be and do something like that. Another thing is we want to know some actor that is known and has targeted macOS. Ideally, the actor has some 80% of the attack lifecycle coverage, and it's been long enough, around enough that have some sort of reputation. So Ocean Lotus met actually that criteria. We recognize that there was not a lot of coverage from threat hunter perspective, so fit the bill. They have a good history of targeting macOS, and they have done custom malware, and they actually some open source exists that not a lot, but we can use that for the emulation. They also have a cool name factor, so that was a plus. So let's talk about the pipeline.
So here's kind of the network diagram here on the right of the infrastructure we set up in AWS for this workshop. So we build it in AWS using Ansible and Terraform, and all those lines of code combined was about 9,000 lines of code to spin up the entire infrastructure for our workshop. And one of the really cool things that we got to be able to do was demonstrate how to use a network tab in AWS to actually collect network traffic, which we'll be talking about how we use later in this presentation. I think yeah. And then some of the considerations for the infrastructure that we set up is that we wanted to keep it simple, right? And that's from the keeping it simple for the workshop creators to access and create resources for the actual workshop, but also keeping it super simple for the workshop participants themselves, right? Some workshops may have people have to do actions before the workshop, or they have to create a VM or something like that. And my tagline for this entire workshop is that you can show up with an iPad and do our workshop. All you need is a web browser to participate in our workshop, which I thought was really cool, is lowering that bar for people to get involved. Lastly, all this code is in GitHub and it's public. And so basically you have a lab in a box that you can use to spin up this exact same infrastructure for yourself. So one of the other things we did for this workshop is typically when you go to a workshop, you get told a set of tools or a single tool that you'll use for that workshop. And we asked the question, why choose? Why not let the workshop participants choose which tool that they would like to use themselves? So for our workshop, we spun up Graylog, Elastic, and Splunk, and we allowed the workshop participant to choose which scene they would like to use for the actual workshop. And so we're pretty much breaking that mold.
Oops, sorry, these controls in here. So for the red team, we use open source tools. Again, the idea is to emulate, right? So it's fair game to even use their malware. But in our case, we use GScript, we use Merlin, we develop some scripts. We create a fake app, just like the one that Ocean Lotus did, which is, faking a Word document. And, sometimes when you emulate, you can actually buy domains that were used by an adversary. So yeah, we did that as well. So before we go into that, now let's talk about the hunt queries and the detections. And these are some ideas because we have a lot more, and we will open source that so you can actually go and check them out. But one of the things that is very important when you do hunting is you want to document your threat hunt. And there's a few things that exist out there. And if Roberto was here, he will know that I kind of nagged to him that he's got the threat hunter spraybook, but it's a bit complex. So how do you make that super easy for everyone to use? And these that we present here to you is as simple as it gets, and is extremely effective. We're going to demonstrate that on some of the things that we have for you. So if you need a playbook that you want to start and you want to document your threat hunts, this is as easy as it gets. Okay, so we're going to then break it down into the phases of the attack life cycle, and this is how we present in our workshop. So let's talk about the initial recon. So again, we're using threat intelligence to drive everything, and there was not a lot of threat intelligence reports about how Ocean Lotus, many even other actors, do recon. So we did not emulate that. Then let's talk about the initial compromise. Now, this is a key phase, regardless of the actor. This is a super important key phase. And for Ocean Lotus, it was not, any different. In here, they have custom malware, and they also had some custom techniques. What you can see in the screenshot that is not very obvious is that each of those 4 things are actually 4 possible threat hunting things or detection opportunities for you to identify these key phase. Now, for the purpose of our presentation, another thing we did is one of the things you want to do is emulate Ocean Lotus. And in the process of doing that, we found a way to bypass Gatekeeper. Now, Gatekeeper is a particular technology that Apple has that basically does code signing, and it prevents for users to run malicious applications. We found a way to kind of bypass that, so there was no user interaction. Now, the issue might have been patched. I really haven't tested, and I really haven't had the time to dig in a little bit further, but this is one of the added bonus of doing emulation. You might come across something that might be of significance, and so this is one of those things. We didn't talk about the Gatekeeper issue because we don't know, and we want to share with Apple first. Another thing that we want to talk about this is during this phase, we created many playbooks. This is just one of them we want to share with you. Adversaries might be leveraging base64 to encode or decode payloads to or exfil data. So what you see here, basically, we use OS query for our login and detection, and we're looking at the process events. And the only thing you can do and really effective is just look for base64-D. Now, D is capital D or lower D, but in our case, for whatever reason, capital D is the one that zooms into the information. So very simple thing that you can totally go and hunt, and you might find very interesting activity in macOS now or Linux or some other places. So let's talk about established foothold.
So established foothold is the phase that comes after initial compromise, where after the attacker has compromised the machine, they want to be able to hold on to that machine and place a backdoor. So the established foothold phase for Ocean Lotus has several stages. The first stage here is a part of a document that the user opens up, and then the malware proceeds to do some cleanup. Next slide. And then after it does that stage, it moves on to deploying a payload and then actually placing the actual persistence, which is a launch agent, which we'll be talking about here in a little bit, and then doing some time stopping to kind of thwart some forensics when happening. And then the last part of the malware is it gathers some post information and sends that data back to the C2. So for those of you who may not know LaunchD or may not be familiar with Mac, we're going to do a super brief intro here on how LaunchD works. So LaunchD has launch daemons and launch agents, and basically those are ways to actually start applications. So launch daemons are when the system boots up, hey, I want you to start these applications on boot. And those launch daemons can be set to enable or disabled, so whether to load or not to load. Launch agents themselves are when the user logs in, I want you to start these launch agents, and they can also be set to enabled or disabled, and those are the common file paths for launch agents. So for Ocean Lotus, they used a launch agent to ensure that when the user logged in, that their malware would run. So basically, they set the attribute run at load, which would say, hey, when the user logs in, run this malware. And they also set the keep alive, which means, hey, if this process were to be killed or it stops for any reason, restart it. So here's kind of a breakdown of the playbook that we provided, right? Is that adversaries may create or modify launch agents to maintain persistence. And so the query to actually look for this activity, so you use OS query, specifically look at file events, and then even more specifically, look for file events that are creating new files with an extension of .plist. Another hunt hint is to look for plist that start with the prefix com Apple. This is a reserved prefix by Apple. And therefore, if you see it being used in one of these directories, it's probably something you should probably take a look at.
All right, so let's talk about privilege escalation. So the unfortunate limitations of emulations. This is a very important topic if you're doing emulations. Remember, we use threat intelligence to drive our emulation. If the threat intelligence doesn't exist, we're not gonna emulate it. We wanted to make it as real as possible. So due to the lack of macOS threat intelligence, we did not emulate privilege escalation. And this is macOS threat intelligence for Ocean Lotus. Now, there's a lot of macOS, there's a lot of intelligence for Windows, but we were not doing any Windows. So from this point forward, we sort of stopped emulating and began simulating. This is why the decision is very important. We leverage the Windows threat intel that we have at our disposal and our cumulative expertise to speculate plausible scenarios for macOS and how Ocean Lotus will move around. So with that said, let's talk about internal recon. So one of the things we want to do with the internal recon is we want to list directories, right? We want to do some cleanup of the previous stages. We want to recon files and other things that we can actually locate and eventually exfil. So we exfiltrate SSH keys and we exfiltrate mailboxes. So this is one of the things that becomes very important on macOS and is a detour for now. Let's talk about TCC and FDA. So in macOS, you have the concept of TCC, which is transparency control, consent control, and the TLDR is it limits permissions and access granted to applications. FDA is the full disk access, and what it does is it controls which applications have access to the user protected data. Now, this is where you need to be very mindful. You might unintentionally grant access to applications that can provide valuable access to threat actors. So to explain this a little bit better and why this recon actually works and is effective in macOS, let's dive a little bit more into how TCC kind of works. So let's assume that you're doing discovery, and we kind of do many of these commands, right? You can't do ls, find, and all these things that you're kind of look for things, files in the system. Well, if you have FDA on macOS, and this is your Mac machine, you will see in this screenshot that the terminal doesn't have a check mark. And if I do an ls command, I get nothing. I get a, not permitted. Now, if I go into the soup option, which is the files and folders, terminal has access to those possible directories, downloads, documents, or desktop. Again, user protected places. Again, no check mark, no permissions. So what happens when I do a check mark and I do an ls? Well, I now finally get to see the contents of that directory, right? But this is where things get more interesting. What if a file is under the user path, but is none of those directories? Well, guess what? You're actually able to list that information. And this is why this is very, very important. So if an adversary is doing any sort of discovery, one of the things that you want to be aware is that data that resides under the user path and is not any of those application folders that you saw, then will not be protected by FDA. As a result, it's totally findable. So you want to protect your SSH keys if you're using macOS. So the TLDR here too is that as a hunt tip, if an actor does this for the very first time, chances are that the user will get a prompt that says, terminal wants to access this directory. Do you want to allow it or not? But in case not, what we recommend is you baseline and track applications that are using FDA or FNFP. And with that, you can identify if someone is trying to do any sort of discovery. oops. Right, let's talk about lateral movement. So for lateral movement, one of the things that we did is we basically move SSH keys and we would use them to move lateral, right? And one of the important things about this portion is that, again, the previous section is super important. This is also significant because sometimes when you threat hunt, you might have a detection that actually will help you detect activity across the kill chain. And this is a good example of that. So if you're doing any macOS, you want to threat hunt, we really recommend you look for the use of RSA and authorized keys. And this is just a simple query that you can use to basically discover and timeline and do a table of that use of those keys.
So up until this point, we've only been using host-based data to kind of do our threat hunting. So what about the network side? Go back a slide real quick. So in one of the previous slides, we saw the attacker's view of stealing those SSH keys. And while we did have OS query running on our compromised host, and we had sockets events enabled, for some reason, OS query wasn't generating those events about socket activity occurring, which is actually a really good threat hunting find. But it didn't allow us to actually use OS query to actually see lateral movement. But we had network telemetry, and using Archemy here, we were actually able to go and see our initial compromised host actually moving laterally. So here we're using Archemy to say, hey, show me all the SSH protocol activity that's happening, and we can kind of see all the SSH activity happening. And if we were to kind of drill down more, we can actually see that our compromised host moved laterally to another machine using SSH. So when we were reviewing threat intelligence, we found techniques for maintaining persistence, but they were only documented for Windows operating system. And those are some of the techniques listed below. Maintain presence was not emulated or simulated during our workshop. However, the detection of SSH keys being stolen could be used by an attacker to keep coming back to an environment, or it could be allowed for them to keep accessing machines in the future. So detection of SSH keys being stolen is a really good way to kind of look for this type of activity occurring.
All right, so let's talk about the final phase, which is completing the mission. In this case, one of the things we did is we actually did some mounts, we did some noise, we created some volumes, and we list the volumes and what you would expect, right? We started doing SMB shared activity, we end up compressing information, and then we exfil that. So one of the threat hunt tips for macOS is to actually look into target activity. And one of the things we wanted to showcase on this workshop is how do you think through about how you're going to create your hypothesis and come up with ideas for threat hunt. And this is like as simple as it gets. What we did is we did a series of tar commands, some of them to just kind of generate noise, but also to showcase these concepts. So we have two examples of tar commands. So one of the things you can do is you can actually read the man pages and understand what the arguments do, or you can go to Splain Shell and actually type the whole thing and get familiar information about it. The key thing in here is that this particular command is actually extracting data. When we look at the other command, one of the things we can see is that flag -c, and what that does is create. So one is extracting, the other one is creating. So if I'm getting ready to exfil something, what I'm gonna do is then I create that tar file. Knowing that information, we now have a suitable command with arguments that we can use to threat hunt. So our hypothesis is adversaries or insiders could leverage the tar command to compress data for exploitation. So we use OS query, we look for the process events, and then we look for the tar command and those arguments. Now, here's where it's important. Many of the arguments could be in different order, so it's very important you're aware also of the order of the arguments, and sometimes you need to do some regex type queries to be able to accommodate for the different variables on arguments on commands. Another thing that is was very important for us is that during emulation, it's extremely important to track both the offensive and defensive side. You want to understand from the offensive side what worked and what was hard, what made it difficult for me to achieve my goals. And on the defense side, what you want to do when you emulate is understand what are the gaps that you have, what are the things that the offensive side was able to do, what are the things that you detected well and you can actually improve. So it's very important to keep that in mind. So Another thing that we want to want you to take away with this is from our point of view, when you threat hunt, you're not limited to many of these things. So when you threat hunt, ideally you're looking for visibility gaps. You're trying to uncover data inconsistencies. What's the data inconsistency? You have a Windows machine that has two machines that have the same logs, but one has more logs than the other. So there is a problem in there. You want to correct that. You might want to discover unique artifacts or telemetry that can help you develop new or improve detections. In our case, you might even find a security flaw that can get your CVE. Finally, you want to develop preemptive controls. This is very key. A lot of the things that I hear on threat hunting is about alert and detection, but you want to zoom in a little bit further. What can you do to really prevent the activity? Those are the things that are going to make it more harder for the adversary. And if not, you want to generate the signal to catch them. Finally, when you do threat hunting, you might find signs of active or passive use. That will be not fun. And hopefully, if that is the case, you develop some incident response plan to deal with those things. So, takeaways.
So some of the takeaways, as you've seen throughout this conference and the various talks of today, is that threat hunting doesn't have a single recipe for success. It will vary based on people's experiences and the maturity of their organization. And that was one of the challenges that our team ran into, is that we all came from different organizations with different tools and maturity and different mindsets of how to approach threat hunting. And to try and bring all those mindsets was a lot of fun, but it was also one of those things of how do we take our collective mindset and teach others. And then some of our achievements. So one of the goals for threat hunting was to teach others how to hunt for malicious activity, but also understand that finding in the context of the attack lifecycle, and to understand how the attackers got there and maybe you didn't detect them, and where might they go next so you can try and stop them from accomplishing their mission. To also instill that mindset of creating hypotheses as well, and to unlock our collective power to develop content tools for others. Kind of just wrapping up here. So if you're kind of really excited about this workshop talk and you really want to get involved, let us know. Even if you've never done a workshop before, if you're kind of looking like Woody there, you're like, I've never done a workshop before. That's okay. Reach out to us. We'll help you and show you how to do an actual workshop. For Hunt for Red Apples this year, we actually had 2 people who had never done a workshop at DEF CON before, so reach out.
All right, and with that, we get to the end. So I want to really say thank you to the awesome Hunt for Red team members. This is a collective work that we did possible because we wanted to do something positive for the community. We want to share what we learned, and we want to help you to develop your own threat hunting, program at your own organization, or at least get familiar with it. So kudos to Kat, Dan, and Tilo for all of the awesome work that you all made possible. Obviously, check Dan's new book, so you will like it. We want to say thank you to our friend Sons from the Mitre crew. They help us develop these really cool, awesome graphics that you see. Unfortunately, if we would have been in person, we would give you some cool stickers, but we don't have them, so hopefully we can give them away. Kudos to Roberto Rodriguez and the Open Threat Research community, the Blue Team Village DEF CON team, and obviously the Mitre, Dart, and the Paranoids team from which we belong to for all the support. And lastly, thank you for watching. And if you have questions, let us know. Last word is we're going to open source this. The first thing we're open sourcing is the infrastructure. So with that, you can build your macOS lab so you can threat hunt right now on AWS.
Awesome. That's excellent. I even see from looking at the hallway, there's a lot of appreciation for this work, not just the format and the workshop and everything, but even some specifically because they like attention to macOS, which definitely sometimes feels like it's forgotten when we talk about enterprise threat hunting. So great job. I think we have time for at least one question here. One of the questions in the Slack channel was, could you talk a little bit more about the threat intelligence phase? Like, how did you start with gathering your intel about the Ocean Lotus actor?
Yeah, so, this is where we had different views on how to do some of the things, but ultimately Dan and Kat kind of, connected the dots for us. And one of the things we did is we went and researched a lot of the threat intelligence that exists out there. We basically went through blogs, reports, and everything that existed. We collected all of that, and we started breaking all of those into different phases or activities, and we started mapping them to the Mitre framework. It is a laborious task. One of the things we're gonna do also is we're gonna release some templates that we use on Word documents where we collected all that information that then we can use to map everything. But that is, the research phase is key and it's important. And that's more or less how we did it. If you're doing emulations, threat intelligence is key. And the more resources you find, the better. One last thing I will add is on our documentation, we have lots of links that reference all of those reports. So it's backed by that information.
Yeah, I'll just say in addition to that, Mitre does a really good job of being able to catalog known APTs and all the references that they use. So you can check out Mitre Attack because they have all those groups and all the references that they use. One of the techniques that I used was kind of like type in Ocean Lotus on Google and then space file type :PDF. So that'll like look for Ocean Lotus all over the internet and then pull up all the things that have a PDF that you can download. So sometimes that's a really helpful approach, and you can do that for different file types as well.
That's a good search tip for Intel analysts, I guess. Maybe one other question that I had. One of the questions from the Slack was, except for OS Query, did you guys come across any other tools that provide good macOS endpoint visibility?
Yeah, so go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, so this was one of those really things where we spent a lot of time actually looking at the tools. I think OS Query was the one that we found to be the best for Mac OS X specifically. I know Elastic just came out with like their open source EDR product. I haven't tested it, but I know that it does support Mac, so that is something I want to look to in the future. Carlos, I know you have varying opinions on this subject as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things, there's many tools out there, and we can, help to list you to so many things, and there are like a lot of awesome tools. But we wanted to create an environment, a lab that is reproducible and it's close to like real life. And OS Query is close to real life, and it's been out there for quite a bit of time. And it was part of the easiness to deploy. So there's a lot of reasons why we went for OS Query, and also because it is free, right? So we want to use free tools to make things easy for everyone. But yeah, there's a few tools out there. There are some good EDRs that exist out there. So I'm going to see if I can make some notes and put them on the Slack channel for everyone if they're interested in knowing about those tools.
And one other driving force is that Patrick Wardle has a bunch of tools that are really awesome, but the really hard thing is to enable those tools in logging mode and then to try and get them into a scene. Sometimes the tools are not always as easy to turn on monitoring and then push them into something like Splunk, which is really our driving force for kind of using OS Query because it has that capability built in.
Perfect. I want to thank you both again for dropping knowledge and sharing some of this. I personally obviously love the threat hunting, but I'm also one of the people who is like, great to get some Mac OS in here. I think we need that. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.